All right, so we thought what we would do, what we just went through was sort of a survey of the various scientific spokes in the center and some of the philosophy that will be associated. We also have partners in social sciences, and we're looking for more. But then we also have the Axel component, and that's about really reaching out into the real world. We have partners in the law school, in school of public health, et cetera. And so rather than giving you a short talk for every single one of those components, we thought we would put it into a panel. So in merging these two, we're going to talk a little bit about the real world application and impact of some of the work that we want to do, and also how we're going to bring the world into what we're doing. And then also talk about more around the training and hopefully spend a lot of time answering questions. So maybe I'll have Johann start. If you want to just quickly introduce yourself before you begin.
Yes, hello. My name is Johann. I'm an associate professor here in the philosophy department at Berkeley. My own work is mainly in moral and political philosophy. I was supposed to be the chair of the first of our two panels, which was entitled Research and Real-World Impact. So as Lee says, dealing with some of the spoke elements, the axle elements in the organizational diagram of the center. We're going to try and have a conversation about the role that law, public policy, also public science communication can play in shaping our scientific futures. But at the same time, we also, of course, want to talk about the impact that advances in fields like artificial intelligence, genomics, and so on can have on the criminal justice system, on the conduct of public policy, and on other areas of general public concern. So on that latter theme, let me begin by putting a question to Rebecca. Rebecca has thought deeply about perhaps I should first introduce you briefly. Rebecca is an assistant professor here at the UC Berkeley Law School, working especially on questions in criminal justice. She's been thinking hard about questions about data, technology, and secrecy in the criminal justice system. And so I wanted to ask you, Rebecca, could you tell us a little bit about the role that you expect, especially advances in artificial intelligence, to play within the criminal justice system in coming years? Issues such as predictive policing, perhaps, or the use of algorithms in making bail determinations and trying to assess the risk of recidivism for a criminal suspect. So what are some of the developments that you see on the horizon in that area, and what ethical issues do you think they throw up?
Sure. Thank you for the question. And before I answer, I want to say how exciting it is that the Kavli Center exists here at Berkeley and that you're all here to celebrate its opening. That there is institutional support, such eminent senior leadership that's committed to interdisciplinary work around science, technology, ethics, and public policy is extremely exciting. So thank you. As Johann said, introduced, AI systems are completely transforming the criminal legal system at every single stage, from policing to bail, to evidence at trial, to sentencing, to judging, to parole. And this creates huge needs. So what I want to do to take my brief moment of fame here in front of you all is to actually invite you to join us in the law school to do concrete, immediate, applied work to help solve these needs. How do you do that? Translate your academic articles on AI into off-the-shelf resources for lawyers and policymakers. There is knowledge on AI locked up in the academy. And Kavli Center's public engagement mission and the UC System's public service mission mean that we are uniquely positioned to translate this academic knowledge into as-applied work. Let me give you a couple of examples and then I'll pass it off. Draft model statutes. There was an excellent question in the audience about how companies are using intellectual property laws and contract law to block auditing and contestability of AI systems that are making high-impact decisions on people's lives. You, scientists, can write statutes or help draft statutes that explain why this is not okay. There is a statute currently presented in Congress by Representative Mark Takano from California that would prohibit the use of trade secret law to block criminal defense scrutiny of AI and other software systems used in the legal system. I'm going to be doing a fireside chat with Congressperson Takano on Thursday if you want to join on the Brookings website. That statute also proposes standards. What should we require for quality assurance before we use AI and other software systems to make life-altering decisions in the criminal legal system? You and Kavli could be developing model standards for exactly that. I'm working with Professor Rediat Abebe, Angela Jin, Moritz Hart, Ludwig, oh no, I forgot Ludwig's last name. Anyway, a wonderful group of collaborators right now doing an academic article, and one of the things we're doing to implement it is turning that article into a script for cross-examination questions of expert witnesses on the stand. Public defenders are faced with expert witnesses. They don't know how to cross-examine them. You know how to cross-examine them. You could draft those questions, post them publicly. You know why auditing a system matters. If we can't access the system because contract law is blocking us, you can write an affidavit explaining what you do with that if you got access. Sign it, post it publicly. So let's see. Oh, final thing. One of my wonderful former students, Dana Yao, at the law school, has gone off, got a big law job, doing great law practice, and on the side in her free time, she has created with her math professor partner a platform to match academic scientists, postdocs, grad students, with public defenders who need help understanding and challenging the technical evidence in their cases. It's called PD Query. PD for public defender, query. We've now brought her into the Berkeley Center for Law and Technology, so this is a Berkeley affiliated project. Let's get Kavli members to sign up, volunteer your expertise, helping public defenders figure out how to challenge potentially fraudulent or unreliable AI forensic evidence in their cases. So I'm so grateful that this whole initiative exists and really excited that it has this public engagement mission and excited to help and participate in how to make that into a reality.
Thank you so much for that really rich and stimulating answer, Rebecca. Before we go on to the next panelist, let me ask, are there any questions in the audience for Rebecca about what she's just been telling us about? Just come up to the microphone if you'd like to ask your question.
Which I just took away from you, so just project your voice. Because we weren't supposed to have so many panelists.
And I'm happy to be in communication with anyone who's interested in participating in this kind of applied translation of your incredible academic knowledge. So rebecca.wexler@berkeley.edu. Feel free to reach out.
Okay.
Could I just ask a question of Rebecca? So I think one of the most prominent cases is the Compass system for recommending parole or not parole. There was a big public debate about whether that system was biased or not. And as I mentioned earlier, there are different definitions of fairness, and the company was claiming that it was fair under the definition that they were obliged to satisfy in order not to be sued for being a racially biased system, and other investigators said no, it's biased in this other way, and so on. And they claimed that it's proprietary, so we can't tell you how it actually works. But people have reverse engineered it, and I think the reason that they don't want to reveal how it actually works is because it's actually a completely trivial algorithm. And you can reproduce its behavior almost exactly by looking at two features of the input and saying, well, if this feature and this feature are bigger than this, then yes, otherwise no. And that's it, right? And so if they had just said that, right, then we could have had a much more sensible debate about whether that was a good way to make decisions or not, and people could have tried it in different cases and say, well, look, in this case it doesn't give the right answer, and so on and so forth. So I don't know that these are irresolvable questions, right? Do you think that maybe one solution would simply be to say public agencies cannot employ proprietary, non-transparent technology in making these decisions? So you don't have to avoid laws about trade secrets. You just prevent the public agency from buying that technology in the first place.
Great. So I think this is a really important issue, and I actually was talking at the break. I represented a client who challenged his Compass result that was used to deny him parole after a decade of having no disciplinary infractions in prison, which is an extraordinarily hard accomplishment to achieve. The human being who performed his Compass survey assessment provided a subjective input to question 19 on the Compass survey, saying that in that person's opinion, he did have a prison disciplinary problem, and as a result, he was ranked high risk and denied parole. Now, he had trouble, and what we were representing him and trying to do was appeal that decision. He had trouble because the parole system sucks and you have no rights, primarily. But secondly, because we didn't have information on the weight of the question 19 input factor to be able to argue that the incorrect input mattered to the output in his system and decision. So it's a huge problem. Now, I love Stewart's proposal. Let's just have public agencies regulate this in the procurement process by only buying open source tools. I haven't personally advocated for that position because what keeps me up at night is the idea that maybe we need some intellectual property protection to get the best quality technology into the criminal legal system. You can totally push back on that. Maybe Stewart disagrees, and a lot of people do. But at a minimum, IP laws should not block criminal defense counsel and expert witnesses from accessing this information under a protective order. So my immediate gut reaction as a former public defender is at least let's empower those people doing direct representation in the adversary system at a minimum.
I think I saw another question from the audience.
Yeah.
This is maybe an ill-formed question, but I'll go for it. Additionally, sort of in the parole system, sort of the weighting of who does and doesn't get parole is ambiguous, to say the least. And often those are built on sort of networks for higher level crimes of connectedness of individuals, for which tracking is quite valuable, because once someone's on parole, they lose almost all of their rights, and so you can track their data in ways that are sort of not available for the general sort of civilian public. And this is sort of a question from your field, but is that data available on how individual, or is that at the level of beyond what legal experts are able to access in terms of which individuals are being computationally connected and therefore considered for continued tracking based on maybe additional other cases that overlap, and therefore when they apply for parole because of peripheral knowledge or engagement or relationships, they are continued to be denied for the purpose of increased capability to track data and populations.
That's fascinating. So there is a whole movement in parole and pretrial for tracking rather than incarceration. And this was one of the proposed solutions to mass incarceration, and yet it has huge problems, racial biases, costs that are inflicted on people who are forced to pay for tracking devices. And you're raising another issue that I had not thought of, which is who gets access to the aggregated tracking data? Is that being locked up in the companies that are developing and selling these tools for public use? I don't know the answer. I think it's an awesome question. I will point you to my colleague in the law school, Catherine Crump, at the Samuelson Clinic that does technology and criminal defense work specifically. And she has written about and focused on tracking in order to identify some of the civil liberties concerns around it, as well as the fees and fines concerns around it. And I think it'd be fantastic if you were interested in auditing that data, auditing what companies are doing with that data. More broadly, all of the outsourcing and privatization of the criminal legal system functions has led to exploitation of data by private companies, whether it's your cellular communications with your attorneys in prison or something else. So I'd be very worried about it. I don't have an answer for you, but it's a great question, and we'd love to work with you on trying to get access to that data or get standards for who can access it, some type of regulation on what you could do with it.
Great. Let me come next to you,
Sure.
Lee, because Lee is here not just as interim executive director of the center and the MC of this event. She's also a resident expert on matters of science communication and public engagement on matters of science. So let me ask you a question about that, Lee. We often think of, or tend to think of public engagement about science as something that happens essentially downstream from science, right? It's a matter of shaping public opinion, perhaps creating acceptance for new scientific tools or technologies that have already been developed. But I take it you have a different vision for the role that public engagement can play, to play a more active role in the process of science and technology itself. So could you speak a little bit to that vision?
Yeah, so I think it's, really at the core of trying to combine all of these things. If we're trying to think about how to develop technologies and science in a way that benefits humanity and protects human rights, et cetera, and upholds the interests of people, you really have to better understand what those interests are and why and which people and how are we bettering the world and for who and by who and who gets to decide. So all of that, is somewhat in the domain of philosophy and social sciences, but it's also very much in the domain of public engagement. And as you mentioned, I think a lot of what scientists are often exposed to around public engagement is really public communication, which plays a huge and important role because we have a duty, going back to what Jody said, we have a duty to the public because most of us are publicly funded. And so we have a duty to communicate effectively what it is we're doing, why we're doing it. But I would argue that we also have a duty to listen to people who may stand to be either benefited or harmed by the work that we're doing, about how they want that result to look, what concerns they have. And so there's in the realm of public participation, there's this kind of standard spectrum that people talk about, that professionals talk about, where you have public participation that spans the realm from anywhere communication-esque, where it's really you're reaching out, you're trying to inform, and that has a really important role, and often it's the basis of other kinds of communication and engagement. And it goes all the way up to things that try to empower people, and those are really hard to do. And so that would be something like community-based participatory research, where you are actually partnering with a certain community around a topic, and that community has a say in what you do next. So that's, not informing, that's actually sharing decision-making power with an impacted group. And that's really hard. And then there's stuff in between. So there's things like worldwide views events where there's an issue and there's sort of a forum that's held in multiple places around the world, and you try and recruit people to the forum that have a particular point of view, who have a particular stake, and hold these discussions. And there you're really trying to map the problems. And that map can then inform, but it doesn't necessarily have a decision-making power on the science itself. So I think what we want to do here is teach about these different methods, how they work and when to use them, but also implement some of them. And there's a lot of really great communication of science happening here in the Bay Area. There's also some great engagement happening, and we want to be partnering with those practitioners, because really, this is a field that's driven very much by practitioners and less by academics. So we're looking for practitioner partners to do that, to reach out to communities, and part of that is identifying who we should be reaching out to. It cannot just be a majority opinion about something. We need to think about who is disproportionately impacted. Often in sort of polling, there's an undervalue of the voices of minorities or of people that, are otherwise often the recipients of the harms and very infrequently the recipients of the benefits. So we have to try and intentionally reach out to those folks as well and engage them. So I'm going to take that as my cue to go to my panel that I'm supposed to be moderating. So I mentioned that we want to do some training as well as some actual practice of that. So I wonder, Stuart, if you could maybe give a little more information about the training programs. And then if Saul, and I should mention Saul is new to the stage here. Saul's a Nobel laureate and professor of physics. I wonder if Saul and Jody, you could also talk a little bit about your experiences with training scientists and cohorts around these kind of interdisciplinary issues. So Stuart, if you could give a quick overview.
So let me say first that the graduate and postdoctorate fellowship programs are still on the drawing board, meaning that we're open to suggestions on how they should run and very flexible. I think the default notion that we've come up with so far is that they would be 50% funded by Kavli, and then the position would be 50% funded by a spoke discipline or a hub discipline if it's a philosopher or someone pursuing PhD in jurisprudence or whatever it might be. And that suggests that many of these positions are going to be co-advised, might be between a law professor and a biologist, or an AI researcher and a philosopher. The actual content of the person's research might vary considerably. I could see someone doing, really 80% biology and 20% ethics, or it could be 50-50, or it could be 20-80 the other way around, that you're mainly studying the philosophical questions that arise in AI, for example. So we're going to be very flexible about that. What we hope, and this is partly based on the model that did, so Saul, in addition to being quite a good physicist, is director of the Berkeley Institute for Data Science. So just this is a digression, but George Akerlof, who's a Nobel laureate in economics, I invited him to do a speech at an event a few years ago, and I was looking on his webpage just to help prepare my introduction for him, and I noticed that his webpage didn't even mention his Nobel Prize. So he was so embarrassed that he simply stopped updating his webpage the day he learned that he got the Nobel Prize, because he didn't know what else. He didn't want to put anything on there, so he just left it. Anyway, so Saul's director of the Berkeley Institute for Data Science and has implemented a model that actually brings people together from different disciplines where they have data science related problems, but different, the content of the data is different, but the data science aspects of it are often shared, and then they find that by bringing those people together, there are enormous benefits from cross-fertilization. So this kind of collaborative problem solving across disciplines, and I gave a list earlier of the kinds of shared questions that arise across all three spokes, that I think will be enormously helpful. We will have multidisciplinary or cross-disciplinary graduate courses, and I taught one of those year before last, joint with Laura Buchak from philosophy and Shikar Karev from economics, looking at questions of rationality, preferences, decision-making on behalf of multiple individuals, so social aggregation, and Wesley Holliday, who's from philosophy and logic and methodology of science. So it was really an amazing experience. Unfortunately, it was interrupted by COVID. So we went from having, fascinating fermenting kinds of classroom discussions to to early experience with Zoom and how deadening that can be for that kind of interaction. So that was unfortunate, but otherwise it was a really wonderful experience. So I'm looking forward to doing that again. We will try to raise as much money as we can to fund as many of these fellowships as possible.
Yeah, great. So speaking of courses, I wonder, Saul, if you could talk a little bit about your course and how that has influenced your thinking and sort of how it connects with this center.
Good afternoon, everybody. Now, I'll just say that the course that actually Johann and I have been participating in also together with Alison Gottlieb from Social Psychology, Child Development, is called Sense and Sensibility in Science. And it was I think a very good example of what you're describing, Stuart, of these courses where you get conversations between completely different disciplines, thinking about topics that actually, in this case, touch a lot on the topics we're talking about today here, because, for example, we were describing how you get public participation in ethical science issues. One of the parts of the course that we spend a lot of time on is how do you have public be able to deliberate on decisions that they need to make as a society or as individuals that do depend on scientific input. And I realized that as we were just talking just now about the duties that we have towards engaging the public in these, in some sense it's also a utilitarian goal, because I think that we've seen that right now we have a real trouble in our society with people being able to think together rationally and feel that there's a legitimacy in the scientists' recommendations or the scientists, CDC or other, in the pandemic have been very obvious.
Yeah.
So one of the topics that comes up in our course a lot is this topic of, can you get a system working where people are able to begin to separate the values that are in play from the scientific facts that have been established, or probabilities that have been established, so that you're appropriately using the public to think through how they want to prioritize the values and the goals and the fears that go into a decision. It's not, most of these recommendations are not, in fact, a cold scientific recommendation. And the scientists shouldn't be pretending that it's just follow the science. They should be separating out which parts are science that we've so far understood, which parts are science that we're still going to try to figure out, but which parts are actually rankings of values that the public has as much right as anybody, and in fact more right in some sense, to help establish. And you want them to feel that there's legitimacy in how those were determined. Mm-hmm. So it's I see it as a real opportunity that we've been discussing in a course like ours, both for education. You can imagine many courses that would be able to do these kinds of conversations, yeah. But also one of the practical elements of the center, like.
Right. So there's multiple. What I'm hearing you say also is that public engagement has many reasons, right? That it's to inform outwardly, to inform inwardly, and hopefully to also help scientists think about which direction, because we're always presented with multiple possibilities of where our science could go, and getting some information about which one of those paths do we want to pursue. Is important.
It helps in terms of legitimacy.
And it helps in terms of, the public trust of science, which I think many scientists are lamenting is seemingly declining.
And I was going to add just one other thought about Stuart's comment about the use of the possibility of the cohorts that come to a center like ours that would have both advanced grad students and postdocs working together, is that when Jody was commenting before that sometimes you feel you need to wait for the previous generation to die off, a much more humane way to do it is when the cohorts start working together. We found, for example, in the data science situation, is that they begin to develop their own group culture, and they've actually been often the ones who help sort of fight for the next steps forward. In data science, they have to do with replicability and good practices of open science and open software. And they would eventually start developing approaches to it, and they wrote these best practices casebook as a cohort, and that got published. And so you can actually see them as potentially becoming the leaders in that next generation of how do we think about these sorts of science and ethics problems. And what we love is, if anybody has ideas for ways in which they can experiment, that they, it would be great if they were the ones who said, well, we'd like to try out this model of public engagement. And in principle, we'd try to help make it possible for them to actually practice and experiment, and then they would be the ones who would be spokespeople for it in the future as they head off to all different parts of the world where they will become leaders in the field.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm going to actually use that as a transition to Jody before I throw it back to you, Johann. So Saul mentioned sort of the fact that young scientists and young scholars are often leaders in these areas and really pushing the boundaries. I know you've experienced some of that as well, and how that plays out with sort of a long-term cohort.
Yeah, thank you, Lee. Yeah, just building on what Saul was just saying, this is really our secret plan with Kavli. It really wasn't that we would have to die immediately. We did notice, thank God for Rebecca. Well, actually, and we have 2 youngins on the side. But the core planning committee were a little bit with Lee.
We're on the older end, yeah.
But we had about 5 of us who were not super young anymore. But anyway, what our secret plan, sorry, I hope I'm not insulting anyone. Anyway, I've insulted everyone.
60's the new 30.
60's the new 30. We're all the same exact age, actually. The plan really is to create a cohort model, by which we mean, first of all, just to be very logistics-wise, and Stuart's right, we do have to fundraise to make this possible. We're hoping by 5 years from now, we'll have about 40 folks who have already gone through. But we're only going to start with a few next year because we're just getting our act together. But we basically want to build up quickly for the year after that and the year after that. And the goal would be to have a cohort of graduate students and postdocs who do 50% time interdisciplinary work. But the key thing is, on the one hand, your own work will be dual mentored, as Stuart was saying, so you could be in, biology and law or whatever. But the key is what was very successful in BIDS, the Berkeley Institute for Data Science, which is Saul's institute. It's been very successful for people to work together. And I've been involved in my lifetime in 2 things like that. Greenwall, which changed the whole field of bioethics doing that, and something called the Group for the Advancement of Psychiatry. Both those fields, they have people who meet together year after year after year for decades, and they change the field. They are the progress of the field. And we want to create this kind of cohort model. So if you are interested as a grad student or postdoc in working with us, it's not just that you'll get some funding to work across disciplines, but we want you to be part of a group where the group learn from each other and take the mantle. And that's really what the goal that we have.
So I'm sure that hearing Stuart and Saul and Jody talk about the center has whetted your appetite for future engagement and aroused your curiosity about what exactly it is that we'll be getting up to in the center. So if there are any questions from the audience about ways in which you could get engaged with the work of the center, we'd be very happy to take a few questions.
Oh, that's not my exact question, but
Only those questions left.
brought on by this. I'm curious, so as graduate students and postdocs explore these ethical topics, is Kavli Center going to make any authoritative stances? Like, solutions will be generated or proposed. Will you advocate for any of them? I guess what I'm asking is this going to be a research consortium or more like a think tank where we have an opinion and we think this is the way we should move forward, or just we've thought about all these things, you can read these papers?
I think that's a great question. And in some sense, by writing a paper, you are saying, well, here's a solution. You're throwing it into the public domain and saying, this is our thinking so far. It's not authoritative, right? We don't claim any right that because we came up with this answer, we have the right to implement it and so on. But we're putting it into the public sphere. Other people can put other answers into the public sphere, and that's how things are supposed to work, right? No one has authority to implement, except what comes from, the democratic process, which we aren't elected in that process. But what I've noticed over the years, and as I've become enmeshed in these questions of policy, is that contrary to my initial expectations, there are no grown-ups. Right? We all sort of like to think that somewhere there's a room where the grown-ups who actually understand these questions and are wise and experienced and have thought through all the issues, and they're looking after things and making sure bad stuff doesn't happen. They don't exist. And one of the things I think that the fellows who participate in this program will get is essentially some ability to actually stand up, right? When questions arise, when there are things that matter in the world, you can either sit down and let someone else do it, or you can stand up. And leadership, in my view, simply means the willingness to stand up. And I think what the fellows will gain from this process is the willingness and the ability to stand up. And so it might take some time away from your bench biology or your building your AI system, but I think you will be in a far better position to become a leader in your field because this experience will enable you to stand up. And I hope that's what happens. So I think this is a really important question, I think, to understand how things actually work. The lack of grown-ups is a shock.
Is there anyone else who'd like to stand up and
I will add maybe to Stuart's answer that I think part of the axle component, we like our metaphor here, is about connecting with the real world. And so that's through partnerships with the public policy school and with the law school. Unfortunately, Elena couldn't be here. She's in School of Journalism. So I think we will be presented with opportunities to inform policy. And I think how that plays out is very much going to be informed by who is in the center and what their interests are and how it's moving forward.
Yeah, I'm just curious, as a follow-up to that, do you ever see this center, actively engaging in like lobbying efforts or consulting efforts for government organizations, or is it just like a think tank that encourages its trainees to go on and do that kind of stuff?
So technically, lobbying we're not allowed to do. It's against the law for us to lobby in the sense of trying to influence legislators on particular questions of legislation. But I think we pretty much ignore that altogether. No, I think Berkeley has a long tradition of actually advocating for what we think is the right thing. And absolutely, we're, so at CHI, Center for Human Compatible AI, we're consulted all the time. I spent a long time with the EU, the people who were drafting the EU legislation, trying to get rid of the most egregiously terrible parts of it. Just to give you an example of how bad things could be, the EU Parliament actually held a debate on enshrining Asimov's laws of robotics in legislation, literally, putting them directly into law as stated in his 1942 science fiction story, which he admits was only written in order to produce, right, the laws were only written in order to produce interesting plots, right? So they deliberately had loopholes and weirdnesses and conflicts and so on, so that he could generate interesting stories. So that tells you how bad things can get if you don't have expert.
Well, we probably should point out, of course, that we wouldn't expect that we'll all necessarily come to the exact same conclusion within a center, right? So I don't think we'll come up with the party line for here's the Kavli position on this, X or Y.
Yeah.
I think it'll be very unlikely. It'll be more likely that we'll have a whole cohort of people who will become excellent advisors and participants in the political process.
I want to jump in as a junior on this panel and echo Stuart's point that you can just stand up. So if you right now draft a standard, write an affidavit, write a cross-examination script, draft a statute, offer yourself as a consultant to legislative staffers, you will start to have that influence. And you don't actually need to wait. You could just do it right now.
Yeah, so I think maybe part of our job in the center is to support you and to give you the tools. That's part of the training, right?
Perhaps they make some of the connections.
Yeah. So I think maybe you don't know how to draft the legislation, but Rebecca might.
Well, the people that are writing it in Congress are like 22.
Yeah.
So that, bar to entry should be pretty low.
Well, and they work for Exxon.
Right, good point. They're not even in Congress, yeah. And actually, that is one of the things that I'm so excited about the Kavli Center is the opportunity for the Academy to balance out some of the influences of industry in these public policy spaces.
Yeah, so I think it maybe is worth quoting Paul Berg. So in the proposal, we have this quotation from Paul Berg. So for those of you who don't know, he was one of the main developers of genetic engineering, right, recombinant DNA technology. And they held a workshop in 1975 called the Asilmar Workshop, which is very famous in the history of the development of regulation of gene technologies. And in 2008, he wrote a retrospective on that, which appeared in Science. And I'm not going to remember the whole quote, but basically says, the only way to effectively make decisions about emerging technologies and scientific capabilities is for scientists in publicly funded institutions to make common cause with the general public. If we wait until commercial interests and commercial scientists dominate the conversation, it will be too late. Right? And that, I think, that's a pretty wise observation from someone who was looking back on this after 40 years of experience with how things turned out.
Any other questions out there? Also, thank you, Johann, for running the mic.
So do you pay attention of not only our diverse of disciplines, but also different background of the country or race or other stuff or diversity?
Absolutely. Go ahead.
And how? I like to.
Yeah. Do you want to?
So funny though, because I'm being given the mic.
I wasn't sure who it was directed to.
Well, I mean, the whole entire time we were working on the proposal, it's been a huge concern of mine, and I think of all of ours. I feel like we're actually a little bit old and white, and I've actually told a lot of people that. We didn't want to drop out, but we've tried to sort of, I believe, and we've put it in as a commitment, I think, from all of us, that in recruiting our postdocs, first of all, faculty-wise, we're going to create a broader, so we've talked a lot about public participation, but we are an academic institution, and one of the things that we do want to do is just build much more, we've talked about cross-department, but we want to reach out to many more faculty, staff, and others besides students across Berkeley, just UC Berkeley, very much to achieve much more diversity in who's included. But then I think a priority, because, follow the money, is that whatever money we can raise to get postdocs and grad students, I do feel that it's very important to try to get more underrepresented folks up into the pipeline that way. So I do think that that's a very important priority. I don't know if other people want to say anything.
I'll hop in. Yeah, I think it's a great question, and it goes a little bit to what I was mentioning earlier about how you do engagement and with who and why. I think what you're pointing out is that it has to be intentional, right? It can't just be a opinion poll about a topic, and if the majority of the people that answer happen to be white in U.S. of a certain economic background, then that's the answer. It can't be that. So we have to be intentional about in the U.S., but also abroad, because I think every part of all the spokes the scientific disciplines here are international issues, right? We're here in Berkeley, our partners are in Berkeley, but the issues are international. And so we do have to have an intentional approach that doesn't just look here in our own backyard. Maybe we're partnering with people here and abroad. And I think a lot of that also is really putting intention behind how you're thinking about who might need to have more of a say and why.
Yeah, just a little follow-up on that question, right? So there are many issues. We talked a little bit about fairness and the fact that there are multiple mathematical definitions of fairness that people in the machine learning community have developed and then now trying to understand, well, when do you use which one and blah, blah, blah. But other issues, for example, what does it mean for a data set to be representative? This is something that the Institute for Data Science is struggling with. And the field is struggling with, because and we haven't even, I would say, begun to give good answers to that question, right? So let me give you a simple example. You might say, okay, well, if you're doing data sets for medical prognosis or diagnosis or whatever, you should have representation of both male and female possible potential patients in the data set. And maybe there should be equal representation. But what if you're trying to predict problems in pregnancy? Well, it doesn't make sense to have male patients in the data set at all, right? So you'd have only females. Right? But what if pregnancy turns out to very rarely, but sometimes occur in males? And which in some sense it actually can. Or I guess it's really because, in fact, male-female isn't a dichotomy anyway. Well, it's very rare. Does that, well, and then what fraction of males should be in the data set? Should it be back to 50-50? Well, we don't have an answer to that question, right? And we see similar questions around data sets for skin cancer. So there are 7, I think, types of skin, according to dermatologists, ranked basically 7 categories depending on how susceptible you are to solar radiation. And so some will argue, oh, well, then we need to have equal numbers of people in each of these categories, right? But obviously, you might take type 6 and decompose it into type 6A and 6B, and now what do we need? Equal numbers in 6A and 6B as well as all the others. And so that's clearly not a good answer, right? So all the sort of default answers that people propose to these questions seem to have flaws, and I think this is a case where, once again, we need the philosophers and ethicists to kind of help out the data scientists and AI researchers in order to even understand what appears on the surface to be a very simple question. And coming back to the point made earlier, that racial categories are such an antediluvian way of answering these questions. It has, I think the answers have to be, what good is the data? What is it for? Who will benefit from the data? How much benefit is going to accrue to whom from adding one more data point of what kind to the data set? And maybe that's a direction we could go.
One of the major problems we have is ethnocentrism, white supremacy, a lot of social and cultural biases that affect what we study, what we do, what's a problem, what the priorities are. Will there be an ongoing, like you were saying, 2 AIs? Will there be an ongoing reflection of and critique in a positive way of how our basic premises, prejudices of class, race, and so on enter into how these questions are approached?
Yeah.
I think that needs to be sort of an ongoing, reflexive process.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, is the short answer. You're hitting the nail on the head. And I think when we think about what are the questions that we need to engage about and with who, we are also exerting biases about what those questions are that we identified. So it's both about making sure that we are overrepresenting people that stand to be disproportionately impacted, but it's also about how do you inform which questions we need to engage about, or which questions we need to be, interacting with our philosopher friends and our ethicists and our lawyers about in the first place. And so yes, it has to be an ongoing, not just engagement about a specific question, but about what are the questions that we should be asking in the first place.
This isn't inspirational, but I just want to make an operational note for you guys, which is that when you say you're listening, you want to be able to have cross-disciplinary graduate courses.
I know where this is going.
You want to institutionalize this a little bit. You don't want this to just be half-day conferences. That there's an issue with how do you incentivize teaching time for your instructors, and how do you apportion credit for your student participants. So these are issues that, so I'm speaking from experience. So I did this 15 years ago when we set up the Nanosciences Institute, and we had a fantastic first round or two when we put together our courses, and our new faculty hire. But then the issue of, especially people who are pre-tenure, is how do you apportion their teaching time? And if you're an institute rather than a department, you have a very hard time apportioning people's teaching time. So there's little complications of figuring out how do you actually get the institution's cooperation for people's time and credit.
I'll answer that maybe. Yes, you're absolutely right, and we are in the middle of a conversation about that for our participating faculty. How can we enable them to participate? Because, especially at a place like Berkeley, I think there's very narrow criteria by which you're evaluated as a faculty member and as a graduate student. You come in, we are not a graduate program. Maybe someday we will be, but we are not. And so you, as a graduate student, have criteria in your graduate program that you got hired into. You still have to meet that criteria. So yes, it's going to be an uphill battle for sure. I hate to say it, but a lot of it is money. And we do have some money budgeted. Part of the reason that we made these fellows was because we wanted to actually pay them, and that would be a way that they could go to their existing PIs and say, I want to be part of this. I want to spend a certain percentage of my time on these issues, and you don't have to cover my time while I'm doing that. You don't bother using your your grants for my time while I'm doing something that's not part of your grant. I have this other funding. And so that's, I think, really enabling. And we're thinking about other ways to enable faculty. Postdocs are a little different. But yeah, it's a challenge, and I think any center like this faces that challenge. But we do kind of have, I think, lofty goals.
I just want to throw in one other example where we had a similar problem with the data science field when we started the Berkeley Institute for Data Science, where from the point of view, the career path for to go to faculty positions, in the beginning, we found that our cohort that we were producing, they would basically hide the fact that they had done data science specifically as a side work, and they would have to sell themselves as a nuclear engineer or a geophysicist or a social scientist. But over the course of the time, the society and the academic world had changed, and so after the first few years, it became one of the best selling points that that everybody wanted to hire a faculty member who could do both this and that. And we're hoping that we will see that will be part of the movement towards creating that change, so that in a few years, when a postdoc grad students go out for faculty positions, one of the things that will be looked for is, can you show evidence that you've worked in these kinds of areas?
Yeah, so at Chai, we had the same experience. Like, people worried that working on AI safety as opposed to AI capability would be a liability on the job market. And we had foundations approaching us saying, we want to give you money. How do you solve this problem? So our first 3 graduates got hired at Princeton, Stanford, and MIT as faculty members immediately after their PhD. So it doesn't seem like in practice it's a liability because, as Saul says, actually departments are looking to have these kinds of people. And I think the same is going to happen in biology and in climate and so on.
And that may be the best way to institutionalize for course building later if there are faculty in these departments who say, actually, I would like to be teaching in the department in these areas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think there might be a misunderstanding because I happened to be chair of the budget committee, and so I processed about 1,200 academic personnel cases. And I can assure you that someone who goes outside the department to collaborate with others to create a new cross-disciplinary course is going to be rewarded and not penalized in that process. So I think the remaining issue comes down to the bean counting within departments. And it's enormously varied across the campus how that's done. Some departments, the chairman just says, you, and you do this, this, and this. In some departments, the faculty member just teaches the same course every year, and they couldn't care less what the department chair says, they're going to just teach it. Some departments just count courses, like you have to teach 3 courses a year. In EECS, where I am, there's a complicated workload formula with constant terms, linear terms, and even kind of logarithmic terms, which means that when you teach a big course, you get more teaching credit. When you teach a small graduate course, you get less, but it's not linear. So in the sense that if 3 of you teach a new graduate course, you get more than a third of the credit because it's understood that it's more than a third of the work when you co-create and co-teach a course. And so the course I taught with the philosophers and economists, I got maybe, even though there were 4 of us, I got about half a course worth of credit for doing that. So this kind of flexibility is something that I would encourage. So we do need to, I think, try to spread that understanding of how you can have flexibility and still fulfill all of your curricular needs within a unit.
Yeah. All right, I'm going to take that as the conclusion of our combined panel. Thank you all for coming and for being patient with us with our time. I am going to go ahead and just close out the session so that we can all get to the food. We have tables and drinks and food and some high tops, everything outside. It's looking decent weather. So as we mentioned, we're building this and we want to be responsive and collaborative and we want to hear what you all want and we want to be partners with you. So contact us. There's information in the pamphlet. Sign up for alerts for the fellowship application when it comes out soon. And reach out if you have projects that you want to collaborate on. We're eager to do that. So thank you all for coming today, and go enjoy the food. Thank you.